users shouldn't be going in for a capped data limit on their mobile phone contracts and should have unlimited data.
The user is to blame.
Yes, it's users' fault. Well, I've got another little bit to add to that at the end as well, which is quite funny. Not so much Windows Phone 7, but about the kin, but I'll throw that in at the end. Anyway, so I had to remind this chap, certainly speaking from a UK perspective, I hope most of our listeners are aware of this, but some may not be. But I hope that you realise that unlimited data is not really unlimited data. My contract with T-Mobile allows me to have an unlimited data transfers. So one would expect, being reasonable, that I can download as much as I like. Well, yes and no. T-Mobile has a fair use policy, just like every other carrier. And when I hit that fair use policy, that fair use threshold, I'm subject to sanctions. Now, I put a call into T-Mobile because recently T-Mobile have put a press release out to say that all new subscriptions and contracts with their services will be limited to 500 megabytes a month. Now, for somebody with a Windows Phone 7, if the allegation is true and it's leaking 50 megabytes of data a day, then that's precisely 10 days of life your phone has to download things before you hit your limit. And that's if you don't download anything else, if you just leave it as it is, which would be a concern. But going back to the topic, the chap that was criticising my article, and it didn't seek to accuse anybody of anything, but he's the one who's criticising, suggested that an unlimited rate would be suitable and would solve the problem. Well, it doesn't, because when you hit your fair use policy, whatever that's set at, the sanctions are, and this was T-Mobile talking to me, they would prevent me from downloading things like podcasts, videos. They've got some way of blocking any type of download like that. They claimed that I could still surf the net and send emails, but if I reached my fair use limit, then I would be subject to these sanctions. So for me, with an unlimited contract, apparently, it's not so unlimited. And it's something worth keeping in mind if this Windows Phone 7 problem does transpire to be a legitimate problem with many of the phones. Because certainly most people, if they're on 500 megabytes especially, are going to reach that limit very, very quickly. So that was just that little thing. I don't know, Roy, if you wanted to make any mention of that. It's if there's anything you want to add on to that.
I wrote about phones in the context of the DRM and things to do with the shop. Obviously, you think about the shop, you think about commerce or to do with repositories, things like that. In the case of Microsoft, it's a lot to do with DRM. So ensuring you can only run certain types of applications, fetch certain types of applications, certain conditions, and maybe run them within a limited time frame, things like that. And a person basically broke the core of this whole mechanism of the shop. So I think it was a proof of concept being posted that basically it was cracked, and then any person could just take it from there and do anything they want with the shop on Windows Phone 7. So from now on, unless Microsoft patches the problem, which they have to do using the firmware, they will actually be in a situation where any developer who develops on the platform will not be able to ensure that they can control how many copies are made and how they're made. And that's a real serious disaster to the company. The other thing I wrote about was the faking of the numbers of the phones and also fake shortages, which I found extremely funny because in the case of Windows Phone 7, that's like the worst thing they can do is to fake shortages or to claim shortages instead of actually claim things like high demand. They only sold like under 1 million so far, as far as I can tell. They claim 100. They claim 1.5 million, but I said, well, 1.5 million is just in warehouses, and some of them are like Microsoft employees getting them, like forcibly in a sense. So here again, we have the company faking shortages. We have developers barely developing for the platforms. I think the numbers cited by Microsoft is about 5,000 people not really developing for the platform, basically porting their existing application to the API necessary to comply with in the case of Windows Phone 7, and then you have this supposedly 5,000 applications where the developers themselves cannot even assure that people will be downloading without kind of cheating. They call it pirating the software, and I think the number now, maybe you'll correct me, Android has just passed 100,000 applications, and Apple has got over 200,000.
Yeah, well, I think the amount of applications, it was actually funny enough, it was a subject that was brought up by one of the commenters on my article about this, making a reference that number of apps doesn't equal quality, which is quite true, but it's especially true when you're a Windows Phone 7 supporter who is only touting about 5,000 apps, I believe they've got in their database. There's quite a few arguments with the Android marketplace, for example. New developers, would they find their applications swamped in the midst of a plethora of other applications? Would they get the attention that they want for their application in the midst of all these other ones? And I think they would. If you want me to comment on sort of the viability or the quality of the Android marketplace, I think it's fantastic. Most of the applications are free. You get the silly applications, but these are the things that people like. It's the things that you talk about in the office. The Star Trek phaser, the lightsaber, silly little applications that do nothing but give you a cheap laugh for about an hour and then you delete them off your phone. So I think it's very good. I can't comment much on the Apple marketplace because I haven't really had much experience with it, and I can only say the only thing I know about the Windows Phone 7 marketplace is that it's got about 5,000 applications. Really, that's...
I get the impression most companies that say something about the number of applications not meaning much, which by the way I kind of agree with to a certain extent. It's usually the companies that don't have many applications that say that, and I'm mostly kind of looking at Nokia when I say that, because they're trying to argue in favor of MeeGo and companies going with MeeGo. Of course, MeeGo has the advantage of having Intel behind it, so Intel has used its connections with the I think it's called like Geneva or something. It's an acronym. And it's a kind of a consortium of companies working towards putting Linux inside cars, inside vehicles in general, and Intel is then putting MeeGo inside cars as a convenient replacement for, of course, what used to be Mobilin, and also used to be Memo, but here you have these platform which might not have many useful applications for users or may not yet have any killer applications. That's the other thing is you might say, well, Linux doesn't have as many applications as Windows, but it still has a web browser and stuff. But the tricky things comes when you talk about the big applications or big games and things like that. And I'll be the first to admit that it would be nice if many of the big games even ran under a Wine or the latest and greatest games. And usually that's a bit of a sticking point. So Microsoft here doesn't really have some of what they would consider to be the most desired applications in all the mobile platforms. They probably get all the kind of fart applications, if it can be called an application at all. And they don't actually get, did they get anything like Angry Birds just yet? Because they used to kind of fade.
Oh, yeah, the Angry Birds, for people that don't know, Microsoft got a bit of stick from the Angry Birds developers when the Windows Phone 7 was first being advertised, apparently, and I never saw the icon in question, but apparently on some PR literature of Microsoft's for the Windows Phone 7, they used an icon or a graphic from Angry Birds, and of course the developers weren't very happy about that because they hadn't authorized its use, and at that time Angry Birds wasn't being developed. I believe there's a working version of sorts in place that has yet to be released onto the public for the Windows Phone 7, but that's going off my memory, and I believe tweet I read from the Angry Birds developer. I'll stand to be corrected, but I do think it is coming for Windows Phone 7. If I could just add, though, you can actually see the desire by some developers to jump in with the Windows Phone 7. We see a lot of people saying, well, why would a developer want to go with a platform which maybe doesn't have many people, many users, much of a marketplace to sell to? But when you look at it, I've had this long discussion with a developer on this particular article, and one of the comments that I think draws out from all his paragraphs was that I think a lot of developers are looking at it like a bit of a gamble. If it pays off, they're the first on the scene, and they've obviously got the birth of the marketplace where their application is going to be in the forefront of, because it's going to be one of the first few there. And I think that's why some developers go to it. My argument would be to any of them is that you need a user base to sell your application to, and if you haven't got a user base, you haven't got a developer, and vice versa. It's sort of a vicious circle. So who knows? I'll leave it there before I ramble on.
I think might get an answer sometime in the end Is it the end of this month or beginning of next
I,
month
I,
when they get some responses in terms of numbers of sales,
yeah,
things like that?
I thought, I believe I read it on Microsoft Watch that it's February. And I believe, isn't that when the developers start getting the returns on their sold applications?
Yeah.